Welcome to Math Science History. I have a special episode today that includes an interview with Daniel Shiu, where we discuss his latest article, The Influence of Bletchley Park on UK Mathematics, which was published in the Taylor and Francis journal, Cryptologia. It is such a wonderful article about Bletchley Park and the eclectic individuals that were involved in the groundbreaking cryptanalysis and cryptography applications that helped end World War II. As Daniel writes in his abstract, his paper considers how the experience of these and other mathematicians at Bletchley Park informed and influenced the mathematics produced in their post-war careers. It is a fantastic article that shows how much of an impact the brilliance that came out of Bletchley Park had on the United Kingdom's academics. And if you are interested in reading the article, I will put the link in my show notes. But before we begin, first, a word from our advertisers. So before we begin the interview, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Bletchley Park and then Daniel. Bletchley Park was a top-secret British code-breaking center during World War II, where mathematicians, linguists, and engineers worked to decrypt enemy communications, most famously the German Enigma and Lorenz ciphers. It became a hub of innovative problem-solving, bringing together some of the greatest minds of the era, including Alan Turing. Their success not only helped shorten the war, but also laid the groundwork for modern computing through the development of early programmable machines like the Bomb and Colossus. The techniques pioneered there, such as statistical analysis, pattern recognition, and automation, shaped the evolution of cryptography and information theory. Bletchley Park's legacy lives on in the fields of cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, data science, and computers. Daniel Shiu, my guest today, began his career as an academic mathematician before joining the United Kingdom's Government Communications Headquarters in September 2001. He spent 20 years there in a variety of roles. He was the UK's head of mathematics research for cryptographic research and quantum information processing. He was part of the initial National Technical Authority function assumed by the new National Cybersecurity Center, as well as the head of the Heilbronn Institute for Mathematics Research. Daniel is the recipient of many cryptographic awards. Additionally, he contributed historical articles to the GCHQ website and puzzle books. For the past 4 years, Daniel has been working in industry, helping to rethink 21st century internet encryption. And so, without further ado, let's have a conversation with Daniel Shiu. Thank you so much for being part of Math Science History.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to it a great deal.
I absolutely loved your article on the influence of Bletchley Park on UK mathematics, published in Cryptologia with Taylor and Francis. And I have so many questions. It's one of my favorite subjects, but I was enthralled with the people that you address, including the ones that most of us know about: Alan Turing, Bill Toote, Gordon Welchman, and Jack Good. Tell me more about the individuals and their connections through Bletchley Park.
So I think individuals is a great term to use. So Bletchley Park was full of very unique, oddball characters. And this is partly because at the beginning of the war, it was envisioned as quite a small effort, and nobody was quite sure what the sort of next set of skills necessary to do cryptanalysis might be. So Alistair Denison had quite a sort of broad remit, and initially was going around recruiting a very diverse bunch of people. So as well as sort of mathematicians, he was grabbing chess players, puzzle setters, and magicians even. But amongst those were very promising young early career mathematicians such as Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman. But that was initially just part of a roughly 150-person setup at the beginning of the war. And as the sort of mathematics really began to prove itself, they really began to expand and seeing that, oh yes, they could really turn this into an industrial scale intelligence operation. So they started recruiting more and more mathematicians until by the end of the war, there were probably about 10,000 people working at Bletchley Park in total. And the network grew quite organically. So it started off just as friends largely of Turing and Welchman. Welchman was very unashamed about recruiting everybody from his college, everybody he taught, even former school friends. Turing called on people he'd formerly worked with, such as Sean Wiley and Max Newman. But these friends had friends of friends or other people they thought might be suited to work. And it grew into quite a large selection of people. But it wasn't just the mathematicians as well. It's those 10,000 people. They also included linguists, engineers building some of the machines used there, a very, very large sort of group of people, which we sort of consider perhaps an IT department these days. And those were largely drawn from the WREN service, the Women's Naval Auxiliary. 76% of the people at Bletchley Park were women, and analysts on top of this. It's the mathematicians who very much fascinate me, though. And I was interested that looking at the names of people who worked at Bletchley Park, you got some people who weren't famous perhaps for their cryptanalytic contributions, but became very, very famous as mathematicians, winning some of the top UK awards. So these would be people like Max Newman, Henry Whitehead, Ian Castles, Sandy Green. And it was fascinating to me exactly whether there was a connection between the fact that they had an awful lot of their mathematics in common, as well as this Bletchley Park experience.
I'm curious to know, did they initially, the 150, did they all work together or were they separated into different areas?
They were separated into different areas even at that stage because it was a very, very large problem set. Most famously, Bletchley Park was dealing with an awful lot of Enigma systems. There was a lot more cryptography flying around the world at that point. Even the Enigma machine came in lots of different variation sizes, and you had different teams working on different types of Enigma machine and dealing with the volumes there. As well, old forms of cryptography, such as code books, are still very much in use. So there were also people, for example, working on trying to crack the Japanese systems, which were still very much based on handing out these very, very large books full of code words, which were then super encrypted, and then seeing what could be done to sort of recover some of those.
And in your paper, you talk a great deal about Jack Good and his influence there. At what point in the beginning did he enter into Bletchley Park and begin his influence?
So I think he was one of the early people gathered in by Turing and Welshman in the sort of early 40s. He was just recently graduated from Cambridge. He'd come in as a sort of very pure mathematician. He was a student of G.H. Hardy, was very much interested in that sort of pure mathematical side of things. But it was while he was working at Bletchley Park and working alongside Turing that he suddenly sort of had this epiphany, this sort of road to Damascus moment where he suddenly realized, my goodness, I can think about statistics in a different way than I have been doing and suddenly do something which is very, very useful to this cryptanalytic effort. He worked very, very closely with Turing, but his initial impression that he made with Turing wasn't a very good one. So the first time Turing encountered Jack Good, he was actually taking a nap during night shift because he realized that he needed to be sharp and focused when something important happened. Turing wasn't at all impressed by this, but later on, as Good made some very, very good mathematical contributions, Turing got over that and they formed a very, very good working partnership.
After reading your article, I realized that. I thought it was fascinating. He said he had his epiphanies through his naps. And that's why, he would often take those naps.
Yes, I've said that you got a lot of eccentrics and oddballs working at Bletchley Park. I think Jack Good really leaned into that. He was somebody who just got interested in so many different things, and you sort of read about his life and the sort of how deeply he got into chess, how he sort of acted as an advisor to Stanley Kubrick working on the film 2001, how he got interested in computer art or the all sorts of use of computers and artificial intelligence and things like this. He got so interested in so many things and I think leaned a little bit into his eccentricities on occasion.
So his influence then leaned into Bayesian statistics and Bayesian thinking. How did his influence change the workflow at Bletchley Park and then influence the mathematics overall in UK academics?
So, at the time leading up to the Second World War, UK mathematics was very much of the belief that statistics should be approached from what we now call a frequentist or classical point of view. And Jack Good wasn't sort of having much sort of progress thinking in that sort of way. It's a bit of a tricky distinction to explain. So, I have a friend, Malcolm, who sort of said frequentists and Bayesians both do the same calculations, but they think different thoughts while doing them. But the sort of point of Bayesian statistics versus classical statistics, in the classical sense, you sort of have this thought in your head that there's this actual underlying truth, and all of your observations are just sort of helping you get closer to that underlying ideal. Whereas Jack Good now found himself sort of thinking in a sort of Bayesian way, where instead you sort of say, no, I'm making observations and they're changing my belief about the state of the universe, and I'm using them as weighted evidence to sort of see what I should change my beliefs to. So perhaps your audience will be familiar with something like the Monty Hall problem, which, again, it's an example of how thinking about statistics in different ways can become very, very confusing. People thinking about the same problem can come to quite different conclusions. And to the frequentist, the idea that sort of opening a door and sort of saying there's nothing interesting behind this somehow is telling you something about what's going on behind the other doors is something that doesn't sit naturally with a frequentist. But Bayesian would sort of say, yes, that's telling me something. And now it's giving me evidence about my initial choice of which door I used and how I should reevaluate the chances of me being right because of that and what the actual sort of state of affairs is. And what that meant was this was a viewpoint which was very, very powerful for people doing cryptanalysis. So when you're doing cryptanalysis, you're trying to uncover some sort of secret setup, some sort of secret key, some sort of parameter that the encipherer has chosen. And to begin with, you start from a position where you should be believing pretty much anything is possible. I have no reason to believe one thing or another. But as you study more and more of the message, calculate more and more statistics of that, you should start changing that belief, starting to say some of these possibilities are not going to be true, and some of them are perhaps more likely because of what I'm being seen. And Bayesian statistics gave Good and Turing the sort of possibility to be mathematically precise about how those beliefs should be changing. And in particular, they realized that these calculations that you could do were very, very suitable for doing automatically on some of the devices that were being developed at the same time. So you have this wonderful coming together of being able to metricate your beliefs at the same time as being able to calculate those beliefs more effectively because of the computers that were coming online. And that turned into something very, very powerful for cryptanalysis that still informs an awful lot of what we do today. But at the same time, Good realized that the benefits of this viewpoint weren't going to be limited just to cryptanalysis. And there are whole different ways in which people should be adapting their beliefs based on data, based on statistical evidence, and tried therefore to popularize this Bayesian approach, writing a book on the weighting of evidence, probability and the weighting of evidence, trying to bring people around to this viewpoint. The sort of classical frequentist body within statistics wasn't always very welcome of that thought, and the book wasn't always very well received when it was first published. But now, as more and more people came on board with the idea, it's now sort of viewed very much as a classic, as he sort of then spent a career jumping between government, academia, and other places, just trying to convince people that, yes, sometimes the Bayesian way of thinking about things was just going to stop you being confused and lead you to the right answer and be very, very effective about doing it.
You bring that up, and then you also bring up how it affected UK mathematics. Prior to Good's book, what was the academic environment like with regards to either using Bayesian statistics or being more of a frequentist?
So I'd say that the most famous mathematicians in Britain at the time, people like Fisher and Jeffreys, were largely coming from the frequentist camp. And Jack Good, throughout his career, I think, found himself constantly having these debates with people like Fisher, who did some absolutely brilliant statistics, but did think about statistics in a very different way to Jack. Jeffreys, perhaps, was a bit more willing to sort of try and take different perspectives on the same things. And there was a conference sort of saying that, yes, Jeffreys himself did sometimes use the Bayesian viewpoint. And Jack was always sort of looking to sort of have other evidence he could use to sort of say, no, sometimes it's the right thing to do, and other statisticians are doing this thing. The sort of major figures, Fisher and Jeffreys, I'd say at the time, weren't as welcoming of a Bayesian and were more in the frequentist camp, but weren't at all involved in any of the effort at Bletchley Park. And I think that gave Turing and Good the sort of opportunity to sort of reinvent statistics for themselves. A lot of the sort of methods that Turing was writing down, he didn't realize that he was reinventing statistical theory that was already known. Turing was typical of doing this. He did this with a number of various different methods. It was Jack Good who sort of turned around to him and started saying, yeah, I think I agree with that. I think it works, but isn't this just Bayes' theorem? And Turing said, oh, is it? And was very much surprised to him that he was recovering things that were perhaps already known.
We'll be right back after a quick word from my advertisers. The camaraderie that they had and the connections that they had ended up changing the courses of some of the individuals. And how often, I'm sure your research in this was extensively deep, how many of those cases happen where people became friends and all of a sudden their career just took a totally different trajectory?
So I don't think I captured everything, but it was very much a recurring pattern that you see. The very nature of the work the fact that it's the classified community, it inevitably makes things a little bit insular. You can't talk to anybody who's not involved with work about the work, and you're always a little bit on edge about giving something away accidentally. So, in addition to working alongside these people, you tend to socialize with them a lot more. So there's lots of accounts of the fact that, yes, in addition to working together, they'd also socialize together. They'd go to the pub together, play games of chess, set each other puzzles, do dramatic acts together. And they very much grew friendships as much as they grew working relationships at the same time. And one of the really nice things about Bletchley Park, I think, was the fact that the technical work was approached in a very, very non-hierarchical manner. So although you had the early career mathematicians alongside the great figures of UK mathematics, these people who'd already established their careers as professors, alongside people who were really only just completing their undergraduate degrees, when they got together and started talking about the technical side of things, none of that sort of outside prestige mattered. What mattered was the quality of the ideas. And you'd read about the sort of tea parties they'd hold and the fact that they just throw questions open to everybody. And it didn't matter whether you'd been a sort of professor at Cambridge for 5, 10 years, or whether you'd only just really started learning about the problem from working on the system as part of the Wren organization. Your idea would be listened to on its merits. I think that also kept things very informal. And the sort of first name basis meant that you had these professors talking to these undergraduates as friends. And at the end of the war, then, it's no surprise that people wanted to keep these connections going. The professors who sort of take to shine some of the people working with were saying, come along, do a PhD with me. Or various the students who'd sort of enjoyed working with these people sort of said, I don't know what your mathematics is, but I'd love to work further with you. So Bill Tutt, for example, when he would look for a supervisor, his first thought was to look for people who'd worked at Bletchley alongside him. And not just within the educational realm, when they got into their research careers, because they knew each other, they kept track of each other's research. And so a lot of people who'd worked with David Rees got very interested in a very big paper he'd written about semigroups, which was not too widely covered in the area of mathematics. But they got interested in some of the questions that arose from that. And all of a sudden, you had this pocket of UK expertise in semigroups that were all friends of David Rees in some ways, that had only really got interested in the work because they'd known David from Bletchley Park. So you got this strange second order effect that because they got along so well socially, their mathematics continued to overlap throughout their careers.
What cryptographic tools and applications were created from Bletchley Park, and how did Bayesian statistics help to develop them? I know you mentioned this in your article, and I know the answer, but I would love for you to share that with my listeners.
So, as I said, there were a lot of activities going on at Bletchley Park. Everybody's most familiar with the Enigma machines and the bomb devices that were built to attack those. Those very, very important, perhaps used the Bayesian techniques less than the other ones. I think the area where Bayesian statistics proved itself were partly amongst some of that codebook work that I talked about. So some of the mathematicians, such as Ian Castles and Edward Simpson, found use for Bayesian statistics attacking those codebooks, and Edward Simpson wrote a bit about his war work doing those. But the sort of big proving ground, I think, was in the attack on the Tunny system, which was used by the German High Command. It was a teleprinter cipher where the sort of traffic volume wasn't as great as it was for Enigma, but the intelligence value of knowing what the High Command was thinking was absolutely critical. And there they found that, yes, the Tunny device really did have this sort of very statistical attack that can be used. And they started building these very, very sophisticated devices for the time, the Heath Robinson machine and the Colossus computer, which your listeners may have heard of, again, to do these calculations of statistics that could lead you to change what the beliefs about the settings of the machine were until you're absolutely certain that you'd recovered the actual settings of the device. So it was the devices such as Heath Robinson and Colossus, I think, which were the really, really big killer applications of Bayesian statistics at Bletchley.
When we started talking, you had talked about the quote mythology of Bletchley Park. It's an interesting term. And I'm curious to know, what are the mythologies of Bletchley Park?
So again, it's something we've only sort of come to realize in the later half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st. Some of the what feel like almost impossible feats of cryptanalysis. They were sort of taking this machine new age of cryptography that was supposed to be having more combinations than the number of atoms in the universe. Everybody was sort of had this very, very strong belief ought to be unbreakable. But then they were sort of turning this into an industry where they could break it at scale. And the sort of number of different breakthroughs that were continually occurring, often just as you needed them most, were absolutely incredible. So Turing was able to build on the work of Polish cryptanalysts like Rejewski, Zygalski, and Rysziki. And when the sort of baton had been passed by the Poles, their methods worked for the first part of the war, but behavior was changing, new models of Enigma were coming out, and there were huge months when suddenly there'd be blackouts of traffic and people were just desperate for the next breakthrough, and then somebody would just, at exactly the right time, seem to have exactly the right idea. The story of the Tunney system that I also mentioned, the sort of breaking out by hand of an initial operator error by Brigadier Tiltman, one of the great sort of pencil and paper cryptographers of history, which was then passed on to Bill Tutt to do this diagnosis of the machine that nobody had ever seen, but he was able to deduce the entire workings of the device just by having this one set of output from it and being able to realize that there were mathematical patterns in that. And then being able not just to turn that into an understanding of how the machine worked, but how it could be attacked, but the necessity of sort of the scale of computation of that then would be required didn't seem to be too scalable until people sort of said, oh no, we can start building these incredible devices. And this huge breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough, moment of genius after moment of genius after moment of genius, to me, it is like something out of myth. It is something that's legendary in the sort of things that they were able to achieve there. And it's something that I get very, very passionate about, as you've probably found out during the interview.
Yes, who wouldn't? What came out of Bletchley Park was monumental, no doubt. As Bletchley Park started, and then as it continued to evolve into a large group of individuals, what was the dispersion into academia like? How did this affect academia? And at any point within this, was there this connection where academia was working almost in parallel, or I should say almost in sync with Bletchley Park, as far as mathematics go, as far as the applications of statistics and computational analysis?
Yes, so I think it was a sort of very significant amount of manpower that was being pulled out of academia to work on these things. And you saw increasingly as the war went on, some of the sort of teaching was being suspended, and the undergraduates who were partway through the degrees were actually being pulled into the war work at Bletchley Park. So some people, like Peter Hilton, for example, had done 2 years of his undergraduate degree before being pulled into Bletchley Park. As a result of his work there, they decided to award him a full degree. Other people had only done 1 year or so and so had to go back to their studies after that. Other people like Bill Tutt had never actually formally taken a mathematics course or been enrolled as a mathematics student at Cambridge. But when he emerged at the sort of end of the Second World War, having done this marvellous work at Bletchley Park, they decided straight away to make him a full fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, which he was always worried was a bit of a giveaway that he'd done something very, very important mathematically while at Bletchley Park. But yes, it's the drawing of effort sort of meant that academia was seen as the primary recruiting ground for this huge industrial-sized effort, and as a sense, there was a sort of a bit of a hiccup in the sort of development pipeline of mathematicians because of that. After war, then yes, these, as I say, these associations continued, but then you had the groups that had been formed continued to work together and then brings an awful lot of what they'd learnt into academia. So when Max Newman went to the University of Manchester, he sort of said, I want to start building some of these devices that I know work, and I know despite their flakiness, they can make real world contributions to sort of science, to mathematics. And I know the people that I want to help me with this. I want Jack Good, I want Donald Mickey, I want Alan Turing, because they know alongside me exactly how to coax the best out of these very, very early examples of what I think is going to be a very, very important technology.
What I love about Bletchley Park is its influence in so many different areas. And you had noted in your phenomenal paper that influenced academics. How did it also change the application of computers? I'm assuming Bletchley Park was on the front line of this.
So yes, the development of devices, of the Heath Robinson device, the Colossus device, these were breaking new ground in technologies. People started building computing devices out of valves rather than the sort of electromechanical adders and so forth that we'd formerly had. And people like Doc Keane and Tommy Flowers were really pushing forward some of the technology there. And that meant that, yes, after the war, we had this huge body of expertise in sort of computational electronics that went on to inform everything that was going on at Manchester, building the Manchester baby computer, at Cambridge, at the ACE Labs, trying to build that first generation device there. And even people like Tommy Flowers went on to build a very famous device called Ernie, which was used as a random number generator to select some of our premium bonds draws for the UK government tax system. So again, you had this fantastic body of expertise that was used to working with these somewhat flaky early devices, but had the sort of confidence to know that they worked. And I think that helped push forward and bring about the sort of uses of those devices within science to earlier than it would have been otherwise. So when you had these early devices, a lot of people said, sounds interesting, but they take an awful lot of coaxing. Sometimes they fall over. Sometimes they get the answer wrong. You've got to be very precise about the instructions. But the Bletchley Park crowd had a lot more patience with them. So Turing was using them to start doing computations of the Riemann zeta function, one of the most sophisticated uses of computer technology that you'll see, while other people are still busy using them to compute Fibonacci numbers or prime numbers and so forth, very, very basic high school mathematics. At the same time, you had people just wondering what the extent of what you could do with these machines could be. Could you teach them how to play chess? And the speculation about whether these really could lead to a sort of artificial intelligence. So people like Donald Mickey, who started his life as a classics student and then at Bletchley Park became very, very interested in all of the technical side of things, finished his career as a very, very significant name within computer science and artificial intelligence, became obsessed with these sorts of questions. And similarly, Jack Good and Alan Turing and Max Newman. And again, I think that helped drive a conversation that's still going on, perhaps is getting even more momentum these days as we move into what people are calling the AI era.
That being said, the AI era, how much, I'm going to, if you don't mind, backtrack just a bit back to Bayesian statistics and then the applications at Bletchley Park. How much has that contributed? And I'm sure it's enormous. How much of that do you see direct connections with our current applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning?
So again, yes, the ideas behind large language models draw an awful lot from Bayesian statistics. You sort of gather a large amount of data about people's uses of language and sort of say, okay, I've seen this much of a sentence so far. What's the most likely next word? How would I base my evidence? I draw conclusions from what I've seen from all the rest of this corpus. And I'm again using these Bayesian methods to do that sort of prediction or backwards prediction in some cases as well. I think it was a very natural choice in the UK to name our big data science effort the Alan Turing Institute. And I think that recognizes some of the really keen insights he was having about the fact that Bayesian statistics was not just a good set of thoughts to be thinking when trying to sort of understand what's going on with these connections and how we should be changing our beliefs based on what we're seeing, but also that it's very, very tied up with what you can do very, very efficiently with the computer. And that's the sort of revolution that we're continuing to see today. So I think the Alan Turing name is not coincidental and very, very appropriate indeed.
Most certainly. Naming it the Alan Turing Institute, no doubt, is more than appropriate. He truly was a genius in his own right. And his contributions to Bletchley Park, as well as the security of the United Kingdom, was exceptional. So how did the work, the theories and applications of Turing, Toot, Welchman Good, and the many other brilliant individuals at Bletchley Park completely change the application of computers? Would you say it was linear or exponential?
It's hard to say because there wasn't really such a thing as a computer before Bletchley Park, and it was a lot of the technology development there that allowed them to build some of those early devices. So, yeah, I think the personalities of Bletchley Park and the early days, certainly of the UK computer activity, very indivisible. Any sort of early effort you saw within computing, sooner or later you'd come across a name there who'd been working at Bletchley Park and knew that these things would work. So I think it sort of definitely helped accelerate that and that sort of belief that these and knowledge that these machines really could work and be incredibly effective. I don't think you could sort of really separate out what it would have been like without the Bletchley Park crew.
We'll be right back after a quick word from my advertisers. So, as we begin to move into an era of quantum computing, how can the duplication of Bletchley Park practices serve as a blueprint for the applications in classified work?
Right. So, my advice to the classified community, to the GCHQs, the NSAs of this world, is the first lesson to learn is keep academia close. These academics can have wonderful new insights, and they're really, really brilliant people. And I used to be the head of an institute in this country called the Harbour Institute, which is where GCHQ makes best use of the UK's academic mathematics talent. I think that's a critical resource to the sort of classified community to sort of keep that link strong. The other lesson I'd sort of say in the sort of early days of quantum computers is make sure you've got people who know how to sort of coax what can be somewhat flaky early generation devices into doing something useful. So I've said that, yes, a lot of the early generation computers were very unreliable in a lot of ways, and they took a lot of patience and a lot of belief to work with. We're seeing similar things as we realize that, yes, getting these quantum computers to behave can be a very, very tricky thing, and errors are going to creep in from the outside world. And a lot of the sort of challenge of quantum computing is dealing with some of the flakiness and some of that proneness to errors. And having that sort of core belief that things are going to work out is the other thing to do. So learn how to cope with that sort of flakiness, I think, is the other lesson for quantum computing.
How would that look, like having the patience of working with these older generation devices look as far as applying it to what we're doing today?
So I think there's a very important area of study here for what's called quantum error correction. That's the ability to sort of keep your quantum computer running while it's getting these garbles and errors introduced, but representing the information in a redundant way so that all of those errors still don't stop you from reaching the final answer in there. I've got some friends at a quantum computing company called Riverlane who are very, very excited about these sorts of challenges and sort of saying, yes, there's an awful lot that can go wrong with these sort of early generation quantum computers, but there's also a very, very good chance we can work around that by doing some very, very interesting mathematics. So that sort of quantum error correcting codes is the sort of key technology that I'd be tracking there.
So there is hope for legacy applications in quantum computing.
There is hope that, yes, we can start getting benefit out of these things quickly. It's a very, very different way of doing computations than classical computers. I don't think we're fully understand the space that we can explore perhaps yet. But just as the sort of early generation computers turned out to be the killer devices that you need to sort of get this huge benefit from Bayesian statistics, I think there are certain problems that quantum computers are going to be uniquely suited to, particularly in materials design and science simulation. I think those are going to be able to take us into places that our current classical computers are never going to be able to touch.
Yes, that's going to be quite a movement. I'm looking forward to seeing how material science actually begins to evolve out of this. So, then how do you think, as far as the lessons in the history that Bletchley Park brought us, how do you think this is going to influence the future of cryptography and cybersecurity? And as well as, I should bring up, there are other institutions like Bletchley Park that since closed its doors, but how do you think they can contribute or will influence the future as we head into a whole new world?
Right. So I think as an example of real technological acceleration and unthinkable sort of speeds of breakthroughs on what were considered intractable problems, I think there's a very, very good model to be had there. And I think there would perhaps be similar lessons to be learned by a good examination of things like the Manhattan Project or the Apollo program at the times when we have seen very, very rapid technical advance. But looking specifically at Bletchley Park and also perhaps its US partners at Arlington Hall or various other things like that. That sort of mathematical breakthrough and that collaborative acceleration, I think they're very, very important to be lessons to be learned there. So, yes, the first lesson of Bletchley Park, I think, is to sort of be very, very accepting of eccentrics and oddballs and different viewpoints. The sort of divergent thinking that different viewpoints on problems can bring to you, this sort of change from sort of taking the accepted frequentist viewpoint and using Bayesian statistics instead, or looking to have computations done at great speed using different technologies than they're currently being tried. That's very, very important, provided huge dividends for everything they were doing at Bletchley Park. And I think the intelligence community needs to be continuing to accept these new and different thinkers to have these spectacular breakthroughs that it continues to need. I think the second lesson would be to return to what I said earlier about the working patterns at Bletchley Park being very flat and non-hierarchical. So the fact that you had professors talking to undergraduates as equals on first names terms, where all that mattered was the quality of the thought that was being brought to the conversation. And that's incredibly important as well, that nobody feels that they can't bring something up and that it's going to be judged on the merits of the idea rather than any perceived status that the sort of speaker has. And being able to collect a much wider net of ideas really increases the number of good ideas you can have on that. The third thing that I would really recommend is the Bletchley Park lesson of being friends with the people that you work with. And the fact that they were making a social network at the same time that they were making an academic collaborative network, I think made that network all the stronger and continued it all the longer, because these were people who liked working together, whether it was on extremely important classified work or a chess opening or trying to puzzle out the latest word palindrome that one of them had come up with. They just really, really enjoyed sharing ideas on all sorts of different ways. And I think that's an incredibly good way to run a technical team to this day, to sort of work alongside people who are friends because of their common interests and because of their ability to just exchange ideas on all fronts.
I think we need more of that in the workplace everywhere. That is phenomenal. Thank you for stating that. So, speaking of working together and getting together socially, and just the concept of puzzles, because I know you've written some puzzle books. I would love to hear more about that because in my family, we're big on puzzles. We love games, and I love gathering with friends, and that's our social connection. Tell me about your puzzle books.
It's going to come as no surprise that GCHQ is very, very fond of puzzles and has an immense puzzling community. And you can't sort of go into GCHQ without sooner or later somebody presenting you with some little brain teaser, and that's especially true in the sort of crypto mathematics community there. So it's something I quite readily fell into when I was working there, and to the stage where I sort of fell into setting some of the puzzles myself. And I can say that while I was there, I was asked to help with one of the very early GCHQ Christmas cards that we've now got. They've now got very famous for producing on an annual basis, where in addition to sort of sending out a little card to everybody who works with GCHQ, sort of saying, have a great Christmas, they say, here's a little puzzle to go alongside it. And that initial one that was put out suddenly caught the imagination of the entire internet by the sort of design of it. It had this multiple set of stages that led you to ever more complex and tricky puzzles, to the extent that we accidentally crashed the GCHQ website. It was becoming so popular. People got very, very excited about that. And after we did that, GCHQ was approached by publishers sort of saying, people loved the Christmas card. Do you have more of these puzzle sorts of things? Would you like to do a puzzle book? And I was part of a small group that contributed a small number of puzzles to the GCHQ puzzle book, which, again, had a level of success that nobody was quite expecting and was suddenly charging up the bestseller lists, I think threatening supply of certain print materials at various points. That was another incredible success. I think I contributed maybe only about 4 or 5 puzzles to that one. But it did lead us again to the second GCHQ puzzle book, which we had a bit more time to think about, and I think perhaps shows a bit more of that development. And there, I was able to contribute a few more puzzles as well as a few historical observations for the GCHQ puzzle book too. And again, you can find my name in the back of that as a puzzle setter, historian, and editor. Since leaving GCHQ, I've continued to sort of compose puzzles. I've got a weekly column in the Times of London newspaper called Mindset, where each week we set 3 different puzzles there. And a collection of those puzzles, again, can be found from the Times publishing arm, and you can get them from most good online booksellers, I believe.
So, just to clarify, it's through Times Publishing?
It's done under the Times of London brand. I think the publisher is HarperCollins, but it's Times Mindset Puzzles, and there's just 1 volume at the moment.
Fantastic. I'm waiting for 2 of them. One is the Times Mindset, and there is another one that I ordered as well.
I do hope you enjoyed them. We had a lot of fun putting them together. Some of them can be very, very twisted in the way that perhaps only a cryptographer could come up with, but I hope they're all enjoyable.
Nothing more enjoyable than a mind bender. I want to ask you what your final thoughts are, because your article is so thorough and it goes through so much: the human connection, the developments, the mathematics, its influence on UK mathematics. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to add to your paper that you couldn't actually put in that you would just love to say to my audience?
I would say that it came about because I was used to very much hearing the story of the difference mathematics made to cryptography. I wanted to sort of trace the reverse journey of the effect that cryptography and cryptanalysis had on mathematics in the aftermath of Bletchley Park. I think it's something that I've viewed as incredibly important to the health of both communities, both the intelligence community and the academic community. These connections took place. And my own experience is having worked on the connections between the intelligence community and academia, I think that continues to be true. I think we continue to see benefits on both sides. So, having worked with the Harbour Institute an awful lot, where again we were trying to connect GCHQ with academic mathematics, the sort of overall benefits, not just within the intelligence community, but for the UK as a whole, and for particularly the UK academic community, shouldn't be underestimated. When the UK wrote the Blackett report into quantum technologies, it sort of said, we think that yes, there's going to be an incredible change that's going to come about because of these new quantum technologies. And we look to organizations such as the Harbour Institute to provide some of the skills necessary to exploit these. And similarly, the Alan Turing Institute, we're busy seeing how data science and artificial intelligence might be another sort of planetary changing opportunity technology-wise. And again, the ideas have already been played around with significantly by academia and the intelligence community, bringing these groups together, making sure they work together, making sure the network works as widely as possible and that as many viewpoints are taken up as possible, I think is absolutely vital for the future exploitation of technology that I hope we're about to see from these areas as well.
I agree. I do too. I'm very excited to see where we move forward. Before we go, I did want to ask, and I know we brought it up initially, about your MC Escher Lego creations. I think some of my audience members would be really fascinated to hear about that. And if you'd be open to it, sharing some photos with me via email that I could post on my website.
So yes, this is another different hobby. And again, I mentioned that Jack Good was a hero of mine for becoming interested in so many different things, including mathematical art and computer art. I'd always been a fan of MC Escher, and I'd attended a talk by a very good mathematician called Lenstra, who'd been uncovering some of the mathematics behind one of Escher's pictures. I was mentioning this to a friend of mine who I'd been sort of saying, oh, you can do these marvelous drawings, which are based on non-Euclidean geometry and Riemannian surfaces. And he said, doing that with drawings is boring. We should use some computational power. You could do this with photographs. And we started out then recreating some very, very interesting photographs of ourselves, which were recursive and sort of turned into these, what they're now called spiralysis or Droster pictures. But it also sort of brought us together to sort of chat more about other of Escher pictures that we both liked. And he was also a huge fan of making Lego art. So he'd done various topological sculptures made out of Lego, of minimal surfaces and other mathematical objects. And he sort of said, could we perhaps try to recreate the Escher print gallery picture you've been talking about out of Lego? That project turned out to be more complicated than we thought, but we did have other ideas for ones that we wanted to do. So we found ourselves quickly finding that, yes, you could use some of these nice ways of manipulating digital images to perhaps create some of these impossible effects. And sometimes they didn't need to be that sophisticated. So you may be familiar with the Escher picture ascending and descending of the infinite staircase that always appears to be going upwards and upwards and upwards, or downwards and downwards and downwards if you go back the other way. We managed to make a model out of that from Lego, which people found absolutely fascinating, and I love looking at. Similarly, his picture relativity, which has all the various different angles of gravity, was fun to do in Lego, where you had the studs now appearing on all different surfaces as well. Happy for you to sort of show some of those pictures on to your audience, because I think they would be fascinated.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this article. I think I've read it 5 times now. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for being on Math Science History, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So, to conclude, this conversation has offered a remarkable window into the enduring impact of Bletchley Park. not only as a pivotal site in the history of codebreaking, but as a profound influence on the development of mathematical scholarship in the United Kingdom. The spirit of camaraderie among its individuals fostered an environment of collaboration and intellectual growth that extended far beyond the war years, shaping the landscape of British mathematical research for generations. For those interested in exploring this subject further, I highly encourage you to read Daniel Shiu's article, The Influence of Bletchley Park on UK Mathematics, in Taylor and Francis's journal, Cryptologia, which I have linked in the show notes. There is so much wonderful and revealing information to unpack. The camaraderie, the connections, the mathematics, and as Daniel so eloquently titled the article, The Influence of Bletchley Park. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, Carpe Diem.